morning. My name is David Pollock. I'm yet another BHA trustee and also the president of the European Humanist Federation. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Richard Norman to you. Richard has been in the humanist movement for almost as long as I have, dating back to the 1960s, and has more recently been the president, I think it is, of the East Kent Humanists, where I was very pleased to visit a year ago, I think. He was a former, now retired, professor of moral philosophy at the University of Kent, Canterbury. He was a founder member and still active member of the Humanist Philosophers Group. And he is going to talk to us about what the subject is. Meaning, you know it then, made or discovered. Richard, over to you. Thanks very much.
Well, I'm going to begin by trying to enlist your sympathy. First, coming at the end of a series of such talented and engaging speakers, what is there left to say? Indeed, what is there left to say about the meaning of life? I was hoping that Natalie wasn't going to get round to that, but she did. So what is there left to say? And secondly, I want to enlist your sympathy because actually this wasn't my title. Some of you may know that I was supposed to be doing a debate with Mark Vernon, and Andrew said to me, what we want you to do is you two have a really lively debate to finish things off. Well, Mark Vernon had to pull out, so I've got nobody to debate with. So what I'm going to try to do is to try to make a virtue of that combination of predicaments and try to debate it a bit with the speakers who've preceded me, and if there's time, hopefully draw you into debate as well. So, where better to begin than with our president? You may remember yesterday, Polly Toynbee said, well, the question, what is the meaning of life? You might think, you might ask, is it a meaningful question? But she went on to say, but it is, and it's an important question for us to consider as humanists. But I do want to linger on the question for a moment, because when you think about it, it is an odd question. The meaning of life. When we ask questions about meaning, normally we're asking questions about language. So we might ask, for example, what's the meaning of the Greek line, phainatai moi kainos isos theoisi? You can see I'm just trying to show off to Natalie because she's already told you the answer. But the meaning of life. Life isn't a language, life isn't a phrase, so how can it have a meaning? Possibly part of what's going on here is, I think, an older sense of the word meaning. I think this, you can tell me if I'm wrong, those who know, but I think it survives a bit more in German, doesn't it? Where meinen and Meinung in German can both mean meaning as applied to language and also meaning in the sense of intention or purpose. And that survives a bit as a verb in English, doesn't it? When you say, you know, I mean to go on as I started, and you mean I intend to go on as I started. So maybe the links with intention and purpose have something to do with why we ask about the meaning of life. But at any rate, it's still an odd question. It's also, I think, a distinctively modern question. I think it's fair to say, as far as I know, that it's not a question that's addressed in pre-modern thought. Although Natalie purported to give you the answer, I don't think that was the question that Juvenal was asking, or indeed that any of the ancients were asking. They are asking questions about what is the good life, what's the secret of happiness. But I don't think the question, what is the meaning of life, is one that occurs in the ancients, or indeed until you get to the modern era. I was trying to think, I'm not a historian of ideas, but I was trying to think of an example of what might be one of the earliest examples of talking about the meaning of life and life being meaningful. The earliest I could think of was this one passage in Kierkegaard. This is not actually Kierkegaard speaking, Kierkegaard the Christian existentialist, but Either Or is written in, as typical for Kierkegaard, under two pseudonyms, and the first half of Either Or, the either, is purports to be written by someone who represents the aesthetic view of life, someone who thinks that life is a matter of grabbing each passing moment and appreciating its beauty. And this aesthetic character then, in a series of aphorisms, says this: my view of life is utterly meaningless. I suppose an evil spirit has set a pair of spectacles upon my nose, of which one lens is a tremendously powerful magnifying glass and the other an equally powerful reducing glass. And that's one of the earliest places that I'm aware of where a writer or a thinker raises questions about life in terms of the concept of meaning. There's another passage from the same work, but I'm not going to dwell on it, partly because it's very depressing and also because we're getting short of time. But anyway, Kierkegaard's an example then of someone who does raise questions about life in terms of the concept of meaning, but why doesn't it occur earlier, and why does it become a problem then? To ask why people start asking questions about the meaning of life, we have to think historically, and again we have to go back to the ancients, I think. If you look at the philosophy of Aristotle, which I suppose turned out to be the most influential of the philosophies articulated by the ancient philosophers, Aristotle's view of the world, very briefly, is that it's a world imbued with purpose. The essence of each thing is its inbuilt potentiality to grow towards its fully developed form. So everything is in its essential nature purposive. So the essence of an oak tree, for example, is that inbuilt potentiality to grow towards the fully realized form of an oak tree. It's a purposive identity. The essence of a horse is to grow towards and realize its potential for being a fully grown horse. And therefore also the essence of a human being is our potentiality, our capacity to fully develop our distinctively human potentialities, the things that make us human. So purpose is built into the world, and it's built into our lives also. And if we want to know how to live, we have to think about what the purpose of a human life is. Now, Aristotle also wants to apply this to non-living things, and that's where it gets a bit strained, because the way in which Aristotle tries to apply it to inanimate objects is that they're all composed of some combination of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and each of these, again, has its natural purpose, its natural tendencies. So earth naturally moves towards the center, which is its natural position in the universe, i.e. on the earth. Water's natural position is above the earth, and that's why water will fall from the heavens but bubble up from the earth. Air, its natural position is above water, and that's why bubbles will rise in the bath and so on. Fire's natural position is above the air. So Aristotle tries to apply that notion of a universe with built-in purposes to inanimate nature, non-living things as well. And that's where at the beginnings of the modern scientific revolution, the Aristotelian worldview begins to come under stress and to crack with the emergence of the physics of Galileo and Newton. People understand the motion of inanimate things in quite different terms, in terms of things being caused to move by impressed forces and continuing in their state of motion unless acted on by something else. The notion that the movement of inanimate things is purposive is dropped. Nevertheless, of course, after the Newtonian revolution, the idea of built-in purposes can still persist, because you can still think of a Newtonian universe as the product of a divine designer, and therefore as having purposes built into it. And that, of course, then in turn comes under pressure with the emergence of Darwinian evolutionary theory. So the point is then that gradually purpose is eliminated from our notion of the cosmos, from the notion of what the universe is. And so there are no longer any built-in cosmic purposes that can give us an idea of what our purpose in life is. And so I'm speculating then that it's the loss of that belief in a purposive universe that gives rise to the problem of meaning, the problem articulated in terms of the concept of meaning. Now, given that, obviously, one response then is to try to hang on to the idea of belief, either to find some alternative set of beliefs in place of the ones that no longer seem plausible, or to hang on to those traditional beliefs. And that's what, of course, certain versions of Christian belief do, to maintain that unless you hang on to that idea of divine purpose and a God who has purposes for you, your life will lack meaning. Sure, you're familiar with that advertisement, advertising the Alpha course. And I think it's fair to say that the advocates of the Alpha Course see the answer as lying. Well, sometimes they see the answer as lying in some kind of belief. Have any of you done the Alpha Course? No, no. Oh, good, good, good. Right. Well, you can tell me if what I say about it is correct. I decided that life was too short, so I sent for the book. And as far as I can gather from the book, the meaning of life is that a belief that Jesus died to save us from our sins. And you can see part of the problem with, if you think that what fills the gap is a belief, it's very difficult to fit it into the gap. So that's one of the problems with supposing that it's a belief. But that epitomizes, I think, the view that to identify the meaning of life, what we need to do is get at a certain set of true beliefs. Stephen Law, you remember, talked yesterday about a whole range of wacky and nutty beliefs. And I think people who go in for such beliefs are typically driven by the idea that if only we could get hold of that secret, esoteric set of beliefs, we'd know the meaning of life. The classic example of that, of course, was Philip Pullman's taxi driver, you remember, who, I don't know whether this is a true story or whether it's an example of Philip Pullman's capacity to create stories, but anyway, his taxi driver said to him, "Oh, I can tell you what the meaning of life is. It's all about the meaning, do you remember? It's all about the age of the ancient pyramids, and they were built long before they were human beings, so they were built by aliens from outer space." And that's, you can all rely on taxi drivers to come up with a classic example of that view of life, that if only you could get at that right set of beliefs, you'd know the meaning of life. But there's a different way of responding to the problem of the loss of belief, which is to say it's not a matter of beliefs at all. And in due course, that is the position I want to defend. But one version of that then is to go to the other extreme and say, since there is no built-in purpose to life, we have to create meaning for ourselves. We have to make our own meanings. That was the point of Mark Vernon's suggestion of a title, Meaning Discovered or Made. And you get that especially then in the existentialist tradition, which Kierkegaard is typically seen as the founder of. I think it's true to say, really, that it's with the existentialist tradition that these questions about meaning come to the fore and come to be seen as vital human questions, with the existentialist emphasis on notions of the absurd and contingency, and following from that the idea that human life is meaningless unless we create meaning for ourselves. Kierkegaard's Christian existentialist version of that idea is that religious belief isn't really a matter of rational belief for which you can provide evidence and reasons. It's a matter of a leap of faith. So in an important sense for Kierkegaard, though he's a Christian, you create the truth of the Christian religion by that leap of faith. And in that sense, for him, meaning is made by that leap of faith. Sartre famously in a lecture argued that human beings, as Sartre put it, for human beings, existence comes before essence. We don't have any predefined essence. We're not defined in terms of some predefined purpose. Therefore, we have to choose our purposes and choose our values for ourselves. And again, Camus famously in his book The Myth of Sisyphus, published around the same time, tackled this question of absurdity and the idea that the only answer to the absurdity of the universe lies in our own choices and our own actions. Famously in The Myth of Sisyphus, he takes Sisyphus to be the existentialist hero, the absurd hero. Sisyphus, back to the ancient world again, Sisyphus was a man who, committed various sins in his life, the most interesting of which actually was that he tried to cheat death. And so when he died, he was punished by the gods, and his punishment was that he had to roll this rock up the hill, and every time it got to the top, the rock rolled down again, and Sisyphus had to go to the bottom and roll it up again, and so on for all eternity. And Camus takes Sisyphus then to be the absurd hero, because what Sisyphus does is to give meaning to the absurdity of life precisely by grasping and embracing that absurdity, the fact that we have to go on performing these pointless tasks time after time after time. This is how Camus puts it. And Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods. It makes of fate a human matter. As human beings, we embrace our fate. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Returning towards his rock, convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, he is still on the go. The rock is still rolling. I love that last sentence. The rock is rolling. You can see why Camus got to the top of the charts in the 1950s. But interestingly, what Camus gives us there is in a way a kind of reversion to belief. Because although in one sense he's saying Sisyphus creates meaning out of an absurd situation, I think Camus is also saying, and that's the right answer. It's not just any meaning that we can create. We have to create meaning in precisely that kind of way, the way that Sisyphus does, by embracing the absurd and by going on living in spite of it. And that's, as it were, a reversion to belief in the sense that it seems to be on Camus' part, a recognition that not just anything will do, that we can't just create meaning in any way we choose, because that would just be arbitrary, and if it has no objective basis, then it's not really a basis of meaning at all. So does that take us back to the need for beliefs, then? Is the meaning of life to be found in the right set of true beliefs? Well, I want to say having the right beliefs is important. Humanism, of course, involves the response to the loss of religious belief by saying that it is important to have the right set of non-religious beliefs, that we do need a framework of understanding, a framework of true beliefs with which to make sense of the world and with which to make sense of our experience. So beliefs are important, but they're not the whole story, and they're no guarantee of meaning. And I think you can see this from the way in which, without people's beliefs changing necessarily, their life can nevertheless lose its meaning through some event, such as the loss of a loved one, the loss of someone, the death of someone who was the center of their life, or the failure of some project around which they'd built their life, so that although their beliefs haven't changed, from that event, life is suddenly drained of meaning. It may lead to a change of beliefs, but it's not the change of beliefs that drains life of its meaning, and therefore that suggests to me it's not beliefs by themselves that are capable of giving meaning to life. Now that kind of experience, the way in which people's lives can suddenly lose meaning in the light of some thing or some purpose that was central to their life, may suggest another view, may suggest that perhaps the answer to the meaning of life is to be found not in a set of beliefs, but in some thing, some entity or some person around which one builds one's life and which confers meaning on it. And again, I think that's also something you can find in the Alpha Course, the view that they take, that the answer, sometimes for the Alpha Course people, the answer would be to point to some thing or some person that fills the gap. If you go to the Alpha Course website, you can find a survey of people's answers to the question, what is the meaning of life? And you'll see that across the United Kingdom, that's a sample of the answers. And they're all formulated in terms of some entity, some person or something which fills the gap. You can also, on the website, get the answers regionally. So coming from Kent, I thought I'd have a look at my home area. And you'll see I was very excited to find that 5% of the people of Kent had got it right. Though my excitement was matched by disappointment that they can't spell. Now, this idea that, this is where I want to bring Mark Vernon in, and I can, since he's not here, I can run the risk of not being told that I've got him wrong. But Mark Vernon's latest book is called How to be an Agnostic, and in that he wants to link humanism very much with agnosticism, and he's very keen on the idea that the meaning of life consists in something, as it were. He's very keen on the idea of the transcendent, which you remember Julian talked a lot about yesterday, the idea that the meaning in human life isn't something we can just create for ourselves. It depends on something outside ourselves. This is how Mark Vernon puts it then. You aim to give yourself to the transcendent. You have no power to determine how it will arise in you. As an agnostic, you have no certainty anything will arise in you, but you are prepared to wait for what might be revealed. Julian yesterday was saying, you remember, that the concept of transcendence is one of those slippery concepts, like concepts of the soul and spirituality, which both is and isn't religious. It seems to be distinctively religious, and but at the same time, if you, as it were, if you try to reclaim it in humanist terms, people see you as it were, making a concession to religion. But Mark Vernon wants to embrace that notion of the transcendent, in terms which both are and are not religious, I think. As far as I understand him in his book, Mark sees the word God as a kind of placeholder for the transcendent, for that which is a mystery to us, that which we can't know, that which we can't understand, which forever lies beyond the boundaries of our understanding. That's why he's an agnostic. But at the same time, he wants to say it's the search for that unattainable, that transcendent, that gives meaning to human life. And that's why he wants to say it's discovered, not made, because it's the search for that transcendent, which we cannot know. Nevertheless, the search for it, it's the search for it that gives meaning to life. There's a bit of Camus, I think, there in it as well. It's just read the quote out. God is the crux issue which forces its way back into the quest. If you buy the recognition that to be serious about the spiritual is ultimately to let go and wait on the transcendent. So what Mark Vernon is doing there, then, I think, is hanging on to the idea that meaning is given to life by something outside ourselves which confers meaning on it. If it's not but some belief, then it's some entity that confers meaning on our lives. We don't create that meaning for ourselves. And I guess to some extent that's an example of the residual influence of the search for beliefs. If only we could get at what it is outside us that gives meaning to our lives, then that would be what we need. But I think Mark Vernon's book also has some better ways of talking about transcendence, and these link up, I think, with some of the conversations that we had yesterday. So, for example, Mark refers to the way in which, through our relationship to the natural world and our capacity to see ourselves as part of something larger, which is the natural world, the natural environment around us, and the vastness of the cosmos, we can have a kind of experience of transcendence. He says in that first quotation, the great thing about nature is that it cares nothing for you, and that forces you out of yourself. It takes you out of your immediate concerns. And that's a sort of notion I want to hang on to, I think. And likewise with what he says about the experience of transcendence coming from some relation to a wider community, and a sense of belonging to a human community that existed before you were born and that will go on existing after you die, and gives as it were, a larger context for your own individual life. He puts this in terms of the concept of history. History fulfills some of the functions performed by religion. It provides a narrative within which people can situate themselves. It takes one out of oneself. That same phrase again. The notion of the importance of transcendence in the sense of something outside yourself that you relate to yourself to, which gives a larger meaning to your life, but without supposing that it has to be some mysterious entity in the beyond. It's something deeply rooted in your experience. And that's very relevant, I think, to the conversation that went on in Julian's session yesterday, where Julian will correct me if I'm wrong, I know, but Julian was inclined to say, I think, though that's, the notion of transcendence is something we can try to hang on to, for humanists, it's something that, as it were, doesn't have the same kind of power that it does in a religious context. Julian talked about the idea of transcendence being provided by a larger humanity, but said that humanity is just an abstract concept. And you may remember that at that point in discussions, Adrian talked about her experience as a breast cancer patient and how her involvement in the shared activity that gave her, I think it was doing things like moonwalk, wasn't it, and so on, how she felt that really did, in ways that seemed to contradict what Julian had said, how that really did give her a sense of belonging to something larger than herself. And I think that that's an experience which we can recognize. And I think that it's an example of the way in which the notion of transcendence and its capacity to give meaning to our lives is something that doesn't involve some hypothesis of some mysterious entity beyond us, but is something that can be conferred on us by our own day-to-day experience. Now, that brings me to my answer then to the question that Mark Vernon posed: is meaning made or discovered? And I want to say that actually, well, sorry, let me step back a bit. The question, what is the meaning of life, going back to where I started, it's the wrong question. The question, what is the meaning of life, is what inclines us to look for some belief or set of beliefs which we think will reveal everything to us, or inclines us to look for some entity, some being, or something which can confer meaning on our lives. I want to suggest that the proper question should be not what is the meaning of life, but what is it that makes life meaningful? And that's where then we can begin to see the way in which what makes life meaningful for us is things that are rooted down in our experience. And so what I want to say is, the answer what I want to suggest is that meaning is neither made nor discovered. It's not something that we can just arbitrarily create. On the other hand, our lives are not made meaningful by discovering some esoteric truth like the age of the Great Pyramids. Our lives are made meaningful by the nature of our experience. And the kinds of experiences that most classically, not the only ones, I guess, but the kinds of experiences that do to play an important role in making our lives meaningful are those which, to use Mark Vernon's phrase, take us out of ourselves. These experiences of being part of something larger, in the sense of seeing ourselves in some kind of meaningful relationship to the natural world, seeing ourselves in terms of some kind of meaningful relation to an ongoing human community that will survive us, and therefore that gives a point to our own finite existences, the relationships which link us to other people's lives. I'm not saying that's a deep truth, some deep belief that is the answer to the secret about the meaning of life, but I'm saying that it's what in our experience makes our lives meaningful for ourselves. Got to refer briefly again to Julian, if I may, because Julian talked at one point about aesthetic experiences, I think, and said that, okay, these moments of aesthetic experiences can be moments of transcendence, but I think his phrase was, they don't stack up. They're just fleeting experiences, as it were, and so they can't do the whole job in the way that religious belief might do of as it were, giving a whole dimension to the whole of our lives. Just a word about that then, because I think it links up with some other things that we talked about yesterday. Aesthetic experiences are important, but I'm not just talking here, when I talk about the importance of experience, I'm not just talking about those momentary moments when you're uplifted by the Alleluia chorus, or standing in front of a Rembrandt self-portrait or whatever. Those aesthetic experiences are important not just as peak experiences, as momentary thrills, but as experiences which carry over into the rest of our lives and illuminate the whole of our lives in a continuing way. And this is where, in conclusion then, I just want to say a little bit about what Philip Pullman said yesterday about the power of stories, and just to be ambitious, to try and reconcile that with what Peter Atkins said about the limitless power of science. Because I think this is relevant, this relates to my distinction between belief and experience. If we're looking for true beliefs, then Peter's right. It's to scientific method that we should look. It's scientific method that can underpin our beliefs and sort out false beliefs from true beliefs. The kind of understanding that stories give us, I want to suggest, the kind of understanding that it gives is not a matter of beliefs, it's not a matter of discovering truths. That's why I think Philip Pullman yesterday was so resistant to the idea of his novels as providing messages, because it's not a matter of some belief that you can extract from them and say, oh, so that's the meaning of life. But what stories do is to help us to make sense of our own experience, to find patterns and connections in our experience. Chris French, in his talk yesterday, talked about our capacity to make connections, to see patterns. Part of the problem, he said, was our inclination to see connections, to make connections when they're not there. But he was also concerned to add that that capacity to make connections and to see patterns is also something positively, vitally important. And he referred to it, I think, as the source of creativity and art. And it's not just the source of people's, some gifted individuals like Philip's ability to create stories. It's also, I want to say, the source of our own capacity to tell stories about our own lives. You remember at one point in Philip's talk, or after Philip's talk, he was asked by Josh, are we the authors of our own lives? And Philip's reply, I think was, if I got it down rightly, well, not in the sense that we make up our lives as we go along. It's not that we, start out by thinking, well, what will my life be? What story shall I make my life? But Philip said, but what's important is that we are able to tell a story about our life afterwards. And after Philip's talk, I had a couple of conversations with two people who are humanist celebrants, and they said that very much fits in with their experience of talking in some cases to people whose life is nearing its end and who want to look back on their life and tell a story about it, but also talking to the bereaved and the importance for them of being able to tell some kind of story about the life of the person who has died and their relationship to other people and what was important in their lives. So what I want to suggest to sort of bring these things together then is that it's fictional stories like Philip's that can help us to tell our own stories about our own lives. There was a lot of reference to George Eliot yesterday, quite rightly, because she is the great storyteller, the great novelist. And I want to take just one example from her novel Middlemarch. The two central characters of Middlemarch, Dorothea and Lydgate, they both start off with very high ideals about how they're going to make an impact on the world. Lydgate wants to be a great doctor and make some great new achievement in medicine, and Dorothea wants to do great work for the poor. And neither of their ambitions are realized. At the end of Middlemarch, George Eliot says that Lydgate regarded his life as a failure. Dorothea also had to settle for much less, and in a wonderful passage right at the end of the book, George Eliot says, although she performed no great thing in the world, her influence on those around her was incalculably diffusive. It's a wonderful phrase, even though I can't say it. I want to just take that as an example of how reading that novel can help us to understand our own lives. We may be inclined to succumb to feelings like Lydgate's, to think about our own lives and think, well, I've not really achieved anything. But to look at our own lives in the light of Middlemarch and that passage can help us to see our lives differently, to make us realize that we can all make a difference. If you put that as a belief, we can all make a difference, it sounds incredibly trite. The power of the story is to help us to see how that can apply it to our own lives, help us to see what's important in our own lives, how in our own lives we have made a difference in ways which are, I'll try again, incalculably diffusive. So that's an example then, I think, of how stories have that power to enable us to tell stories about our own lives, to see meaningful relationships between ourselves and something that takes us outside of ourselves, and so to make our own lives meaningful. Thanks very much.
Richard. Richard. Richard,
You had a hard act to follow coming after Natalie, but I think you did it brilliantly. You mentioned Sisyphus, which brings to mind a wonderful line in, it must be Homer, where he describes what happens when, after a line of spondees about Sisyphus' struggle to push the rock up the hill, he describes onomatopoeically how it came rattling down again. Anticipate pedonticulindator laus sen naes. Anyhow, and the other thing I didn't say in my introduction of you, of course, was about your marvellous book on humanism, which is quite one of the best books on humanism that there is, called On Humanism. We've got a bit of time for questions. Yes. Julian.
Yeah, hi Richard. Julian here. First of all, I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you very much for doing a talk which managed to bring together so much of what has been heard over the previous days. I think everyone really appreciates the effort you must have made to do that. On transcendence, we probably agree more than perhaps the impression was given. Look, here's an example. I had a transcendent experience this morning. I was part of something which was bigger than myself and which I was only a small part of. It was breakfast in the hotel, okay? There's this big buffet and it wasn't just me doing it. Now, of course, we wouldn't normally call that transcendent because although it did satisfy that formal requirement of being something greater than ourselves, it didn't have the kind of significance or importance or whatever to really count. And I think that's kind of the way in which we think about transcendence. Now, my point about religion was simply related to that if you have a religious belief, which is unfortunately false, the thing which you are part of, which is greater than yourself, is just almost by definition greater and more significant than anything that can be created by human beings alone. Now, I think such a thing doesn't exist, so we put it aside. And I also agree that it's not a problem because we can be part of things which are nonetheless perfectly meaningful. So that the point was simply about the loss there was not in any way to denigrate at all what is possible to achieve within the fully human sphere.
I should point out that Julian and I had breakfast together this morning. So I was what made his life meaningful for one fleeting moment. But I think we do agree here, so I don't want to say much more about it. But I think the important point to emphasise, which I think you've emphasised more now than you did yesterday, perhaps, is that it's not just a matter of those fleeting moments like breakfast together, right? But the way in which they fit into a larger pattern in which we do, can see ourselves as part of something continuing, something larger, which isn't just evanescent, but which does have an ongoing character, and the way in which that's important to us. Shall I pick people out? Right. Okay. Okay. I'll create a queue then. 1, 2, 3. Josh first.
Thank you. I would like to say something first on behalf of those people like myself who have probably forgotten more that they've ever read than I can even remember. No, I'm not sure how to finish that sentence.
Sentence.
But the fact is, I think there is. I'm going to not remember the name of the philosopher in question, but there is a French philosopher who made the point not all that long ago that you not only do you not have to remember the things you've read, you don't have to read them in the first place. Oh. You don't have to read books. In fact, most people talk about books and the stories of classical education, etc., without necessarily having read them in the original, as it were. Right. It's a serious point again that the source. The question I'm asking you, in fact, is that there's a lot of talk, depending on where you're coming from, about the books and the authors and the stories and so on. The fact of sharing those and wherever they come from is what it seems to me is important in trying to answer some of these questions, and that it isn't actually necessary to refer back to have read these books in the original or to necessarily know the names of all the authors.
Yeah. Now that's an important point, I think, and that's an important reminder because the way in which I put it, and which I sometimes tend to put it, can sound very elitist, as though if you haven't read George Eliot, you can't have a meaningful life. And of course, that's not what I want to say. And although I have a tendency to sort of take these examples from high culture, I mean, the fact is actually, that we're surrounded by stories. Stories pervade our lives, and the stories that we tell about our own lives always draw on the stories that make up a whole part, that make up the whole of our culture, not just high culture. Every culture, I think it's true to say, as far as I know, this is one of those generalizations I hope one can get away with, but every culture is a storytelling culture. Telling stories, is in hunter-gatherer cultures, telling stories around the fire, I think, is how they spend most of their time. They only spend about 10% of their time hunting and gathering, and most of the rest of the time they're telling stories. And as I say, stories pervade our lives. On telly, in the soaps, in the serials, in popular fiction, in magazines, and so on. And I do think it's the case. You might want to challenge this, but I do think it's the case that we're all the time drawing on those stories and applying them to our own lives, not in conscious and direct ways necessarily. I've got a nice anecdote here, which I will do, about how sometimes it is in conscious ways. When my younger son was quite young, and when they were just getting into boyfriends and girlfriends, he said that they always used to meet their girlfriends in town, the boys' school and the girls' school, after school every day. And one day his current girlfriend just came up to him and slapped him on the face. He had no idea what that was, but she'd obviously been watching EastEnders, and that was the sort of thing you did to your boyfriend when you met him. Well, that's a rather crude example of how someone was perhaps rather too directly applying the story to their own experience. But I do think it is the case, that we inevitably draw on these ways that we're constantly presented with of what a human life might be and how we might see our lives, and that we need that in order to understand how it is that we ourselves are living.
Your talk culminated in the significance of relationships between people and nature. Mm-hmm. And earlier on, you talked about the essential human condition of standing alone, and you characterized that as heroic. And I just wondered if you'd like to say more about how you bring those together or reconcile them in any way.
I don't think I'm not sure they would really. I mean, the idea of standing alone and the heroism of that is more the sort of existentialist position that I was ascribing to people like Sartre in his existentialist phase, and Camus, who never called himself an existentialist, actually. I mean, it's interesting that Sartre himself moved on. Well, indeed, both of them moved on, actually, because they from that high existentialist phase, they moved into politics. And I think, they moved away from the idea that we're on our own. There's a sense in which we are, collectively as human beings, humanists, I guess, are committed to saying collectively as human beings we're on our own, but we're not on our own as individuals. So I guess that's the way in which I'd reconcile it. And it's vital to recognize that we're not on our own as individuals. As Natalie quoted Aristotle as saying, man is a politikon zoon, an animal that lives in a polis, but also more generally a social animal, and it's being part of a society that really is the source of everything that makes us human. Without living in a human society, for example, we wouldn't share a language, we therefore wouldn't have the capacity to understand the world around us. So the sense in which we're on our own and the heroism of being on our own is not an individualist one. Is that an answer? It's an answer.
Hello. Is transcendence necessarily conceptual?
No. Do you want to elaborate the question?
Well, to say that certain transcendence goes beyond what is greater than ourselves.
Yes.
I'd charge that most, well, if not all, transcendence is necessarily conceptual. It's in that it is of the mind.
No, I don't think so, no. And one of the things that I was trying to bring out, I think, and I don't think I did this enough, is that, it's very much, if it's there, we don't think about it. And I guess that's an important thing I want to say about the notion of a meaningful life. Your life is meaningful when you don't have to think about whether it's meaningful or not. Most of the time, we are embedded in these relationships to a larger world and to a larger community and to other people. And it's not that we actually consciously conceptualize it and think, oh, my life must be meaningful because look at all these meaningful relationships in which I stand to things outside myself. The sense in which they take one outside oneself is precisely that you don't need to ask those questions. You don't need to be continually worrying away, about questions of, who am I and is my life meaningful? Because by being caught up in this larger context, those questions are answered without having to be posed, as it were. So no, if I've understood you rightly, no, I don't think it is conceptual. No, I think somebody over here was waiting, and then at the back, yeah, two at the back, I think, one and then two, yeah. So 1, 2, 3. Done here.
Thank you. I'm not sure whether this is a question or an observation or a sort of hope. I'm not sure which to phrase it as, but I was very interested that you ended up with such an enthusiastic tribute to storytelling as something fundamental and human, which is something I believe myself. And awarding Philip Pullman the award Humanist of the Year, the first ever Humanist of the Year, was immensely encouraging too, but I'm not sure whether it represents a sea change or a blip. Because I basically, my story is that I used to feel very well loved in the humanist movement until I wrote a novel, and then I discovered I had become a bit of a pariah. And New Humanist refused a review copy on the grounds that humanists are very serious people. They prefer non-fiction massively to novels, and then when they read a novel, they insist on a serious novel, and mine is quite hilariously funny in many places. So I felt really unloved there, and then I took several copies to the BHA AGM, and nobody wanted to buy them, and I couldn't even give away the display copy. So I was sort of thinking, oh dear, this is something a bit different. This is not good. And then this weekend, we've got this emphasis on storytelling, and I just wondered if you thought this was a bit of a turnaround.
I don't know whether it's a turnaround, but I think the way in which you put it is very interesting, and it does correspond to some of my worries. Now, it's important to get the balance right here, I think. I think humanists can get too hung up on science. Right? Now, I mean, that's not at all to qualify what I was saying. In one sense, I totally agree with Peter Atkins about the power of science. Right? That if what we want to do is to get at the truth about the world, then the scientific method is the way to do it. So in a sense, its power is limitless, but that doesn't mean a power to do what it's not trying to do in the first place. Right? There are other kinds, the way in which I tried to put it in the talk was, there are other kinds of understanding that we need, and I think I do want to hang on to the word understanding, which are not a matter of getting the right beliefs, and where science is irrelevant. Right? And there's a bit of a tendency, I think, on the part of people like Peter Atkins to say, well, science can even illuminate them. I mean, take the case of morality and values, for example. Now, Peter's way of putting it in his talk was a bit ambiguous. Right? Sometimes he seemed to be making an incredibly ambitious claim, science can answer all our questions. Other times, and this was much more on the ball, I think, he wanted to say, in any area of human life, science has something to contribute. Now, that's a much more modest claim. So if you take the example of morality and values, I think science has something to contribute, the evolutionary story about how it comes to be possible that human beings have the capacity for morality, in terms of the evolution of kin altruism and reciprocal altruism and so on. That's an important contribution, but that doesn't mean that science can answer our moral questions. Right? And indeed, when it comes to moral understanding, again, that's another area where I'd want to say, actually, fictional narratives are often, for reasons that Philip Pullman talked about, much more powerful in giving us moral understanding than science can ever do. So I don't in any way want to denigrate science as long as we're not asking it to do the job that it never set out to do in the first place. And so the balance, I mean, I absolutely agree with you then. And I have to say my reaction was the same. I was, when I saw that Philip Pullman was getting the award, I thought, great, because that is getting the balance right. Yeah. Yeah, these are the last two, right there, and then at the very back row.
I'm not sure whether you were actually advocating this, but at one point you were talking about finding a right set of true non-religious beliefs. And I'm not quite sure whether that's not a recipe for finding some sort of religion as well. We lived many years in the old Soviet Union, and there that became a religious society in everything but official adjective. It was and simply because people believed they did have the right set of true non-religious beliefs.
Yeah, I take your point. I guess the word set is a bit misleading. You know, I'm not saying that what humanism needs is some sort of perfectly hewn ideology, but we do need to get things right. Let me just give you one example. Critics of humanism often say, well, if you think if you're materialist, if you think that the physical world, the material world is all there is, that's terrible, isn't it? You know, that means that you're only interested in physical pleasures and in getting as much money as possible. You know, how can you possibly live with yourself if you think that, you know, if you're a materialist? Now, it's important to get that right, to sort that out, to understand what one means by materialism. Important to to get rid of ambiguities in the concept of materialism. Important to see that to be philosophical for a moment, a non-reductive, expansive materialism doesn't deny the facts of human consciousness and human values and so on. So in that sense, it's important to get things right. I'm not saying, though, that we need something which is a sort of package of beliefs that can be adopted en bloc as the secret to life, as it were. So no, it's an important corrective to what I was saying. Thanks. Yeah.
Yes, I'd just like to say I'm a humanist, but also a very naturally spiritual person, and I wonder whether an icon for the future is our little blue planet, a shining little blue planet we've seen now, and the idea of sort of looking after the earth and a sort of Gaia, green spirituality, where that may be a way of sort of finding meaning and purpose, that we're sort of part of the biosphere, we belong to it, and looking after it for the next generations. I personally find that a satisfying worldview for me, anyway.
Thanks very much for that, because that's my cue to mention something that I did want to mention before I finish, and I couldn't think how I was going to get it in. But some of us have set up a network called Humanists for a Better World. Marilyn Mason, whom many of you know, was the person who had this idea. And at the moment, the network just consists in a website, which Marilyn has set up. But the point of it is to really just put in touch with one another humanists who are concerned about the sorts of issues that you mentioned about the environment and global justice and so on. And the icon is of that is a group of happy humanists holding up a blue world. So that's just what you wanted.
Richard, thanks once again for bringing everything to a wonderfully rounded conclusion. A true humanist. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over now to Andrew, who's going to bring the whole event to a close.
Just outside, there are floats and banners and flags and lots of people in carnival costumes. I don't know whether you've seen them yet. It's not for us. That's not the end. That's not for the end of our conference. It's actually Manchester Day. So yeah, in Manchester as well. How lucky coincidence for them. But it gives me permission, that fact, to plug the Manchester Humanists and other Northwestern Humanists group conference later this year, which is a weekend on humanism for the 21st century, which of course is a necessity, given that's the century we're in. And it's on the 8th and 9th of October, and there are flyers just outside on the BHA table. Everyone is welcome. I'm not going to detain you for more than 37 seconds, I think. In my head, that's how long it took to say what I want to say. I want to thank our speakers, all of them. I want to thank all our staff in the office for organising this wonderful weekend. We've crammed a lot into less than 48 hours, lots of ideas, lots of discussions, lots of new people to meet, lots of conversations, lots of food and tea and coffee. And wine. Well, I don't know about that. And we've enjoyed it, I hope. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we've organised a good event for you. But I wanted really to finish with just saying how much we, the staff and trustees, have enjoyed meeting you. We very rarely get to meet members, the members on whose behalf we are working every day, long hours for not much money. And it's been a great pleasure. So next year in Cardiff. Thanks very much.